Right, hello, good morning, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm recording a video today on the topic of Sun opposite Neptune transit, which in the larger context is going to be setting off a more complex aspect pattern known as the kite. Now, to understand this dynamic, first of all, you have to consider that we had a solar eclipse in Virgo at the third decan, the end part of Virgo. And as I record this, the sun is at the 29th degree. Tomorrow, the sun will ingress into Libra. This is the equinox point of fall equinox. And at this, you have to understand that, first of all, the solstices and the equinoxes are all at the cardinal signs mark the beginning of a new season, right? So that if you have Aries, you have the beginning of spring, you have Libra, the beginning of fall, you have Capricorn, the beginning of winter. Technically, it's kind of confusing because some people think of December as being like the winter time, but technically the winter doesn't start until Capricorn season, and then you've got, with other solstice, of course, Cancer starting summer, right? So this gives the cardinal signs the signification of initiating or beginning something that is seasonal and new. And so what you have right now is that you have the biggest, now you have to contextualize this with aspects and conjunctions. The aspects are, if you take in consideration the grand air trine, we have Pluto at the very beginning of Aquarius, we have Uranus at the very beginning of Gemini, and that these are in a trine aspect to each other. And then in the middle of this, we have Neptune at the very beginning of Aries. And so when the sun ingresses into Libra, it will be making an opposition to Neptune, a trine to Pluto, a trine to Uranus, and that there are sextile aspects between Uranus and Neptune and Pluto and Neptune, right? And so this is creating a kite aspect. And what's interesting is that the eclipse had Mercury not perfectly in this kite aspect, but every planet that passes this fall equinox point is going to be hitting off this kite aspect, right? And in what my topic that I've considered to talk about here is, first of all, basically Neptune is often signifies religious delusions or flights of fantasy, those kinds of things, being wrapped up in an escapist fantasy, basically. And that one of the things that would be very emblematic of Neptune transits would be in certain delusional religious belief systems, such as the rapture, right? Now, in my approach to this astrology channel, my approach is kind of like a byproduct of, let me explain this to you, okay? So at a certain point in time, I took a 1-year natal chart intensive course in astrology with a certain popular astrology teacher. And then after that, at that point in time, it was the most of the organizing for people communicating with each other and the alumni was all done on Facebook, right? And so after that, I noticed, not even just within that circle of astrologers, but within other astrologers that weren't connected to that at all, there was a talk about social media clamping down on astrology content or divination content. There's also this whole issue about whether or not you're considered to be like a grifter or a con man if you're just doing things like tarot readings or astrology readings or things like that at all. And that there is some people I've heard talk about, if you're being even just like a tarot card reader on different social media platforms that for people who don't believe in tarot, they see this as just a flat out grift, a flat out con, taking advantage of vulnerable people and stuff like that. And so there's all sorts of issues around, whether or not it's appropriate to be doing astrology or doing divination on the internet or on social media, all this kind of stuff. In the midst of all this, there were a lot of astrologers who decided to take their business off of Facebook and off of, basically also to just sort of do a detox from the whole addictive habit of being on social media all the time. And basically during this time, I moved in with somebody I was in some kind of relationship with, and I was living on Vancouver Island for a while. And there's something about what people are like on Vancouver Island in general, or at least the kinds of people that I was exposed to, that had me. I had contact with people who were maybe anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, and there were also. I'd also had more proximity. They weren't socializing with these people, but you had proximity to the people who I would describe as holy rollers, for example, like Jehovah's Witnesses or stuff like that. And coming out of all this, I had this kind of a motivation of seeing firsthand what happens if you just basically, let's say you have unhealthy addiction habits, or you have some brain injury or something like that, and you are self-medicating your brain injury with chronic alcoholism, and you're losing your critical thinking skills, and then you have an addictive social media habit, and then you're believing all sorts of crazy shit, and it's like there's this kind of, in all that, I felt an intense need to affirm critical thinking and affirm a more rational approach. However, to some people who don't believe in astrology and divination, it may seem as somewhat contradictory, but basically I decided at around this point to basically drop social media. Although I have to admit that I also, eventually after COVID hit and I ended up moving out of this situation that I was in, I became very ill and I was bedridden and I couldn't really do very much. So I was basically like using social media just out of boredom. But then eventually having this plan to basically withdraw myself from social media entirely. And this, like, noticing that it's like this kind of thing about like your mind, even like new age people will talk about this. It's like that your consciousness, you're like a receptor. This is another thing that bring it back to the astrology, Sun opposite Neptune, there's a certain kind of, Neptune's often associated with a certain kind of like sensitivity or a certain kind of being like a sponge that absorbs everything. And there's just kind of like being on social media when you're sensitive is like you're just a sponge for all this like garbage and negative energy or whatever you would say, right? And something about all this, I kind of just had this, what appealed to me about things like astrology anyways was that it actually opened up to learn about people like James Hillman that were challenging intellectually, in that it was like not just being complacent with some Jungian stuff that I learned about in high school, but actually challenging me to like grow my understanding of Jungian psychology or is it not real? It's kind of, he's kind of smashing, tipping over the holy cows of Jungianism. He's not really like completely just like I still haven't even read all the James Hillman books I collected, right? But there's this, I basically had this premise that what if instead of wasting all this time and energy on social media platforms like Facebook, like Instagram, like TikTok, like all this kind of stuff, what if I saved all, because it's not just the energy of like doom scrolling, but there's always maybe I don't want to blame this on the platform necessarily or the other people, but maybe it's just my personality that I end up getting into personality clashes, or you end up in silly arguments with people, or that you're some kind of drama that you're invested in that just drains you of your creative energy. So it was basically, I just thought it would be better to not focus on all that stuff and instead shift my attention towards higher sources of information, basically, right? Or different, better inputs, that so that it's like if I'm creating content to people, I'm not just going and being like the bottom feeder who picks up whatever the lowest common denominator crap there is going on TikTok to then convert that into, I'm going to enlighten you with my insights on it or something, right? Instead, to be humble about, and then about what I have to offer, and instead make myself receptive to higher, more challenging, or better perspective, potentially better perspectives, right? The problem is that, well, I don't know. I've been trying to do this with Byung-Chul Han, and I realize there's certain issues with approaching this, namely the it seems to just sort of emphasize my own certain frustrations with my situation that I'm not going to get into now. But I'm going to. The point is with TikTok, right, that there is a trend going on with TikTok that says the Christian rapture is happening starting today, or as over the course of September 20th, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, that there will be the rapture and the true believers will be teleported into another dimension or to heaven or whatever, and then the rest of us godless heathens will be left behind. And first of all, it's been pointed out if you want to be technical about this, that the rapture is not something that's part of the Bible, or it's not. There's nothing in the Bible specifically that talks about the rapture. It's something that comes from a bunch of religious weirdos who are it's kind of like Mormonism, the way that Mormonism makes up their own stuff. Rather than just sticking to the Bible. So there's this kind of, in the political context, where some Christians want to create a theocratic Christian nationalist state. There are certain issues about what is your standard for what is the accepted dogma of the religion versus what is like heresy, or like, if you're making up a bunch of stuff that's not in the Bible and you're trying to pass that off as the official religion, these are the people that would have to be basically burnt at the stake to maintain the sanctity of your totalitarian Christian nationalist state, basically, right? So there's certain issues coming up with this where there's this kind of polarity in this, and I have been recently, to understand this, I have been attracted to, it's similar to how astrology there's some kind of like childish appeal, perhaps, to having everything neatly organized into like 4 elements, like fire, air, water, and you can like think of them as these color-coded systems of different switching symbols and signs. There is appealing to that kind, like you're just like a Fisher-Price child who's regressed to this infantile stage of reasoning, and you can't think clearly, and so you're just like playing with little like Lego blocks or something like that. I think perhaps my childish, regressively developed mind latches on to things that were maybe popular when I was an adolescent in the 90s, because it's like you can kind of get into this aesthetic of like scholastic. Like scholastic catalogs, or like a whole, dare I say, the whole Earth catalog. That apparently that's gotten a kind of that. I don't know. I'm dealing with certain kind of cognitive dissonance because I grew up on the West Coast, and there was a certain kind of idealism around the utopian new age of internet and globalism, and we're living in a highly interconnected global society with all this kind of stuff. And out of all that, there was a certain guy named Ken Wilber who popularized integral psychology, and apparently at the turn of the millennium, the atmosphere of the post-September 11 world, Ken Wilber and that whole style of integral psychology, spiral dynamics, fell out of favor. But there's something to understand about this, which the spiral dynamics stage, which is either in the original system is blue. Ken Wilber's system, he calls it amber. But there's this one stage called blue, which is all about what he calls rule role thinking, right? Which is like establishing this basic system of language that if you use this word, it means this. If you use that word, it means that. And you have words which are maybe only, a few syllables that you pronounce phonetically that stand for complex structures of organization, right? And that there's a certain kind of reductive approach to language itself, which reduces complex things into simple things, right? And that in this is the same basic process, unfortunately, that connects to things like racism, tribal in-group, out-group dynamics, or basically the problem of the polarized us versus them thinking, right? Because in this system of role-based developmental psychology, there's the basic, like, developing, it's important not to just gloss over this whole stuff about moralism and good or bad. There's basically, from a psychological developmental psychology model, you have the parents setting the rules for the child, and basically saying that we are defined as affirming certain rules, affirming certain ways of doing things as being good, and that to be part of this family means to be in line with what the parents say is good and what are the rules, and that if you don't conform to the rules, it's bad, and that we contrast what we do from what other people do because we believe these things are good and we believe those things are bad, and that at a very basic, there could be more nuance and complexity, but in the same way that when you use the word cat to describe a cat and a dog to describe a dog, you have one simple word that you pronounce that describes a very complex organism that has all these things going on with it. But nonetheless, in order for the mind to work, it has to be more efficient. It has to simplify things down. And so at this psychological level, there are problems that the shadow part of it, basically, where there's unhealthy development or perhaps developmental traumas. This creates this whole problem where things become overly polarized into you're either with us or you're against us, or you're a true believer or you're a heretic, or you're a patriot or you're a terrorist or whatever it is, right? All sorts of polarities arise out of this way of thinking, but you have to basically, even if you're like using the word, if I have a cat and I have a dog, and I have an error in my communication, and I say, have you fed the dog yet, when I actually meant the cat, then the person is going to, you need to have this basic right, wrong, true, false, is the word cat being associated with the right animal or not, kind of thing. You need to, you know what I'm trying to say? And in this sense, at that level of brain development, you need to have this basic, like, it's either true or it's false. It's either real or it's fake. It's either like a concrete real thing or it's a fantasy. And you have to, like, in this level, there's like, it's also the kind of the problem of mythic literalism arises, because there's a certain nuance to religion where, let's say, stories in the Bible are taken to be allegories, to be, the idea is that, or like myths even, right? Ancient myths are to be taken as allegories, in that they're not saying that in ancient Greece you had the gods on Mount Olympus, as if that was, if you actually walked up to the top of the mountain, you would see the gods there, and they would just be like big people, or like, weird ghosts that would fly. It's like that these were, these were symbols that represented archetypes of the collective unconscious, and that to say from a overly dualistic true false, it's important to have this as a basic foundation, the basic true false binary, yes or no, right or wrong kind of thing. So then you can say, if you're using your language correctly to describe objects, which we have this common agreed upon word to designate whatever object there is. But when it comes to myth and religion and all this kind of stuff, a mythic literalist is limited in his cognition to being like, is what is in, is, if our religion is right, it means it's 100% right, and it means that everything in it is true in a very literal and concrete way, and that the people, and so you see, and this becomes funny, because then if you apply that to the actual good book itself, the good book itself doesn't actually say anything about the rapture. This is something that is added on after the fact, the same way that Mormonism and all these other different cults or whatever arise, right? There's still this underdeveloped, there's certain problems or errors of cognition that happen here, right? And what happens is that it's basically built on this thing of this in-group, out-group, yes or no, you're either with us or against us. And it's like everybody that is in our in-group who are good and right are going to be rewarded for being good and right, in the same way that a parent who's trying to train his child to say the right word or to know what the rules are is going to reward the child. These people are all very concentrated into their in-group, believing that they're right, believing there's going to be some reward from a parent figure for being right, and that in their own little cultic mythos, this reward is to be rescued from the troubled, sinful world. And so all the heretical sinners will be left behind to deal with all the problems in the world, whereas the Christian rapture believers will be rescued as if they're like a UFO is going to come and like beam me up, Scotty, and take them off to another planet or something, right? Now, I have to, I've never believed any bullshit like this, but this is also, it relates to some issue for me that's a sensitive topic, because in the year of our Lord, 2011, I was apprehended by the psychiatric system, partly, but I have to take responsibility that it was my own disordered mind that thought that to check myself in to the psych ward would be a good idea. And then I simply was, my right to deny treatment was taken away, because in my split mind, I had one part of my mind that thought it'd be a good idea to go to the psych ward, and I had another part of my mind that thought it would be a good idea to not go to the psych ward. And because of this, because I was not because I was not 100% on board in the psych ward is 100% right or 100% wrong way, and there's a certain kind of cognitive dissonance, perhaps, certain nuance, and that I had not made my mind up. This was enough to take my human rights away, of my bodily autonomy, of what kind of drugs apparently I was just too fucked up. If you even considered going to the psych ward and you have to get second thoughts, that's enough for you to be, legally under the Mental Health Act for the rest of your life, basically, right? And then in this system, I was judged to be a delusional psychotic maniac, right? And because of this, it has created for me a sort of emphasis on the importance to not be a delusional psychotic maniac, but to be very rational and very, very critical about the way I think about things and the way I approach things. But I have to admit that before I'm going to get off my high horse here and admit that although maybe I've never been the kind of person who would believe a crazy religious belief like the Christian rapture, I have to admit that I do have a similar escapist tendency, basically, right? There was, at some point in time, I remember also, like, in this chain of events where I was apprehended by the mental health system, forced onto antipsychotic drugs for a while, and in that, I was kind of a wreck, and I quit my job, and I went through a phase there where the whole topic of UFOs, and I guess it was also the fact that part of the problem, or was that it was 2011, 2012, and the psychedelic scene at that point in time, the December 21st, 2012 was going to be like the Christian rapture for the psychedelic scene, basically. Like it's like the ayahuasca bros version of the Christian rapture. Although the thing about it is that while the Christian rapture was more at this blue level, if you understand what I'm saying, like it's like you have your little cult family that believes this thing basically, and that's basically complete, like the Mormons would believe some version of Christianity, but because they're God's chosen people, they're automatically right about everything and everybody else is wrong, and you're either with us or you're against us, and then we're going to be rewarded for being good by being beamed up by the aliens or whatever, right? Like in that whole dynamic, if that's happening at Spiral Dynamics Blue, there is this, what I noticed about the Christian rapture, or the Christian rapture, the 2012, or my brief stint of like, I saw Shpongle. You guys know Shpongle? I saw Shpongle live. This was basically the peak of it. It was like doing lots of drugs and seeing Shpongle. And the kinds of people that would be in that environment, like if you're going to be like partying at a Shpongle show, chances are you're not going to have your developmental psychology at the blue level, or at least I would assume not. The people that I had contact with in that scene would be more centered around the Spiral Dynamics orange or Spiral Dynamics green. And there's, for example, one of the things about if you were at the orange level rather than the blue level is that there's a certain aptitude for science and rationalism and critical thinking that would often dunk on the childlike immaturity of the blue level when applied to things like that would be typical of, let's say, hippie culture, granola culture. Like, I'll give you an example. It'd be like if a person has a kind of a simple understanding about eating healthy and being that it's like, oh, all things which are organic and natural are healthy, and that the problem with, being unhealthy is that we have so much synthetic foods, so much processed foods, so many foods that are laden with chemicals, right? And it's just, you just have to like purify your diet by going back to earth and omitting these harmful synthetic chemicals from your diet. The people who are at the orange level would scoff at this and say, don't you know that there are all these, if you take a fruit and all these natural things and then analyze the chemical substance, you can come up with this big, long chemical word that would, if you, did you know there's this, blah, blah, blah chemical? And you'd be like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that these chemicals were in my foods. But it's like, that's the whole point, is that, it's kind of funny that when you break this down, like some chemicals are good and some chemicals are bad, right? Like, for example, there are certain things which are like vitamins which support your body they're essential for life. And then something like nicotine is a harmful, addictive chemical that, just makes people have self-destructive habits, and they need have this whole smoking cessation process to cure them of their dependency of nicotine. But then what if I told you that nicotine was actually naturally occurring in potatoes? Yeah, that it's not just, nicotine isn't just a tobacco thing. It's actually potatoes have nicotine in them. If you're at the orange level and you actually understand things from a scientific, rational view, instead of thinking about it as in, oh, well, a cigarette, what is addictive about it is nicotine. That means that cigarettes, nicotine, smoking is all bad. But then then that you don't, in that thing, it's all nestled into this object of cigarettes or vaping. And then you forget that the same chemical could be in potatoes. Or that you could make you could possibly, this is also kind of funny because then if you consider this, you could be a potato farmer and then you could make potato vape juice and vodka from the same thing, right? Perhaps. I don't know, this is just an aside, but the point is that there's this other, rather than being so caught up on what happens if, are potatoes addictive because they have nicotine in them? Do you get a nicotine buzz from eating potatoes? Is that like, I don't know. This is basically what, at this level, at the level of orange and at the level of green, there's another problem about this, which is that the whole psychedelic scene around 2012 there's this documentary that came out called The Spirit Molecule. And it was like, instead of trying to treat the Christian rapture from or whatever it is, like 2012, the rapture's coming, as the end of the world is all going to be like, we're just going to be rewarded for being good boys and girls by the big sky daddy is going to beam us up, and we don't have to worry about all this bullshit anymore. At the orange level, it was all about like, hey, wait a minute, there's this, instead of thinking about the separation between spirit and matter, what if when you die, your body releases all this chemical called DMT, and then you have this crazy, the death is the ultimate trip, and it's like at your end of the life, you have a DMT trip, and this is the same chemical that is released when you're dreamed, and that we can understand all this ethereal, spiritual stuff by being chemists and taking lots of drugs, basically, right? So basically, there's this I'm not really sure what the whole point of 2012 was supposed to be, but it ended up being very cringe and embarrassing and basically disappointing, because it seemed that for all intents and purposes, nothing happened out of it. And that this, from the orange point of view, there's also this, there's blue, there's orange in spiral dynamics, and then there is purple, right? There's purple. One of the problems why spiral dynamics fell out of favor is that in a developmental hierarchy, blue and orange are useful for talking about the problems in America around religious fundamentalism versus scientific rational people. Around Y2K, there's a lot of stuff online about, like, with the new atheism, rationalists versus religious believers. I personally don't really even go for this very much. I'm not really interested in these topics. But there is, part of the other problem is that left-wing or progressive political types tended to resent or resist hierarchical developmental models, which took things like indigenous shamanism and placed them very low on the developmental scale to be like. But the thing is, if you think about this, there's some argument that people make where if you take what we consider to be quote unquote Western civilization, and you go back to ancient Greece, there's this basic idea that people make where they draw the line basically at Socrates and Plato, right? And that prior to Socrates and Plato, there's this whole era that is labeled as being pre-Socratic. And basically the idea here is that the pre-Socratics were more purple coded, and that there was kind of like a early form of shamanism, and that the Plato and Socrates represented a movement out of these old archaic ways of being into the dawn of the modern era, which would become more defined after Christianity got developed, right? And so there's this but there's this kind of problem in that the people who value things like the basically like shamanism or the hippie people who are into like plant medicines or stuff like that, this is all valuing something which is at a purple stage, which is in this developmental model. It's seen as being kind of, basically the point is magical thinking. That the idea is that as civilizations have a developmental structure, that this is like kind of the macrocosm that mirrors the development of a child through adolescence into an adult as a microcosm. And that is a similar thing where there's this touchy subject basically that the there's this big rift between Freud and Jung, basically, because Freud, in the effort to appeal to the values of the emerging orange scientific rational mentality, that if you understand what Carl Jung's whole project was, is that his whole project was to be a real valid scientist, to make a contribution to something which would be objective psychological science. But there was a controversial rift with Freud because in the value system of orange, you're trying to get over the moral binary thinking of good versus bad, of blue, where it's basically just, there are all these things that you like, there's a book of rules, and that the people who get the rules right are good, and then daddy rewards them by sending them to heaven, and that the people that don't do the rules right are bad, and then they get punished and they go to hell, and that this is this kind of childlike, this thing good, this thing bad. If you're in our group, you're good. If you're the enemy, you're bad. Like, this is the basic, or the same way that, smoking is bad, but eating potatoes are good, and then nicotine's bad because it's associated with smoking, but not with potatoes. But then if you look at, you're able to get the scientific understanding, you can see that the same chemicals in one thing that you judge as bad might be in something that's good, and then you have to sort of define the context of what it means for a chemical. What does the chemical mean on its own outside of the social context? Where that maybe it's the social context that makes something addictive, not the chemical. If you want to see what I'm saying, right? Maybe it's not that nicotine's addictive. It's maybe because you get a 15-minute smoko break where everybody's like, what do you do with your 15-minute break at work except for go have a coffee and a cigarette? Like, there's not really, like, what are you supposed to fill that time with? Maybe it's addictive specifically because or like social drinking, it's not the alcohol, it's the function it serves in a social context, right? This is like the whole point of, to break, just rather than having everything nestled into these hierarchies of like, or just good or bad, right or wrong, you're with us or you're against us, we have to start to separate it from the moralism of this and look at in a more neutral way, that it's not that like organic's good, chemicals bad, but it's actually all mixed up, or that there are plenty of organic poison. You know what I'm trying to say? So there's this kind of issue with all of this, that from that way of thinking, there's something from the integral way of thinking, is that the further you progress up the developmental model, you go from orange to green to teal, and then once you get to teal is all about shadow integration, right? There is the difference between teal marks the beginning of what is called second tier, and this is actually an interesting problem to consider what happened in more modern times around Donald Trump and the new age, the problem of the alt-right spiritual scene, or the tendency for all the hippies to go conservative, or however you want to say it, is I saw this happen I watched it play out, basically. And I think what illustrated this for me is that there are people who feel that they have, if they were you to ask them where they're at this developmental spiral dynamics model, that they have, because they understand the orange-blue thing, it's not about this in-group, out-group, you're either good or you're bad, or you're getting rewarded for the rules, or you're getting punished or something, but you can understand the system of you in a scientific, morally neutral, rationalist way of orange, right? Then after that, you get the green level, which is a point of tension, because green is basically the postmodern relativist level in which certain issues, like the sensitive issue around trans people, the sensitive issues around the rights of indigenous people, and the having a multicultural inclusion. We're not doing very well at green right now, right? The idea is that once you've developed green and you develop beyond green, then teal comes online, and teal basically involves shadow integration of all the blind spots of the previous levels, right? Now, what we saw at the time of the Donald Trump and the alt-right and MAGA and all this kind of stuff, where there were a lot of new age gurus or yoga teachers or ayahuasca bros or spiritual teachers, and that they saw that there's a certain kind of binary dualism, us versus them, our group bad, or our group good, that group bad, that's all happening at this blue level. But because they had they would scoff at that as if it was like you are like saying that organic things are good, synthetic things are bad, or like if it comes from the earth, it's natural and good. If it was made in a lab, it's some evil scientist. This binary thinking, that people are caught in this binary thinking trap, and that this was evidence of shadow, basically, and that because they were holistic, enlightened masters who are dedicated to the developmental second tier hierarchy of the blind spot. This is the whole thing, was that if somebody is, if you are somehow triggered by a bunch of if there's a bunch of guys with shaved heads and really muscly dudes who are intimidating, and like they're cops or they're military guys or they're like paramilitary militia or something like that, instead of judging those guys as being bad, that your judgment in that is only caught up to the extent that you have a blind spot and those people are resonating your id. So basically this created this thing where every time a person felt uncomfortable about somebody who represented a political authority, this was an opportunity to them to integrate that shadow. Now the problem is that shadow integration, in the attempt of doing that, from the outsider point of view, it could just look like, oh, all these hippies have just decided to flip sides and join the alt-right, because and if you ask them what they're doing, they're like, well, I just need to shadow integrate, because it was like when I felt like there were these alt-right guys like the tiki torch swastika dudes, or the you know what I'm trying to say, like these are so triggering for me. I obviously had some unresolved shadow burden, so the only way for me to do that was to basically join forces with them against the progressives, who were actually the real Nazis. They're the real fascists, right? Because they were the real fascists because they were so caught up in this in-group, out-group thing where we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, that they don't know their own blind spot, and the more intelligent, highly developed person was going to integrate the shadow so that it becomes more, from the outside point of view, there's less and less distinction between you and the supposed enemy or whatever, right? Or that you're in a holistic point of view where there are no enemies and you're in a holistic collaboration with everything, right? And that so that is sanity. Basically, you create this thing, holistic, I'm holistic, I've integrated my shadow, and I'm basically right for doing this, and the people who aren't at my level of development are wrong. And that if they can't handle the fact that they're wrong, that they feel like they have to kill the enemy, then that means that we are the good guys, they're the bad guys, and then we're back at this. It's like you've completed the circle. You're back at where you started, where you're in this stupid in-group, out-group thing. But you're like, well, I've integrated the fact that that it's not actually just a good versus bad thing, that there's a certain moral relativity going on, but I just have, the more that I'm pulled out of my peaceful center by people who are religious fundamentalists, just means that I have a blind spot that I need to integrate. So I need to compassionately extend my compassionate awareness to those people that are caught in these polarizing dynamics to heal the fragmented wounds in our society, right? So in all of this, basically, I saw this play out, but I have to admit that I have my own struggle for escapism, right? I have my own I have, at some point in time, I had I have to admit that I have my own attraction to wanting, instead of paying attention to the grounded issues that I'm faced with in material life that are most real and tangible, it might feel more relieving to me to just waste a few hours watching videos about UFOs or aliens or something like that. And that I think there's some kind of, there's this kind of escapist thing, right? That is I don't know, maybe this is a change of topic. The whole point of this is that there's some issue here where I've described to you this whole spiral dynamic system, and I've described to you that there's this issue about religious fundamentalism that basically plays out at this blue level, but I've also been kind of slightly sarcastically, well, I don't know. It depends. Maybe there could be a whole range of people, but there's some kind of issue about the teal, this whole second tier teal. I'm so developed, and also it's like, because it's like I'm a martyr basically, right? I'm sacrificing. There's so many people who might think that I am, rather than being on my high horse, I'm going to like extend my compassion to these poor lowly people who are religious fundamentalists. But there's a risk basically of like doing this, that you basically just regress back to that level and you join the cult and you kind of forget about the whole. And what I'm kind of bringing this up is that I saw a post anyways at some point in time where some guy who used to be an integral was like, you know what, maybe this developmental hierarchy thing, it's kind of ironic because it's like it's kind of like a disavowal of the developmental hierarchy, because in the name of I don't know. I'm just filling in the blanks here, but it's like there's a risk of like getting to the top of or trying to go to I'm the master. I've mastered my development. I'm at the top of the pyramid. Now it's time for me to shadow integrate all these things, these blind spots that bother me, like these religious fundamentalists. It feels kind of good to be in this in group where everybody just unconditionally accepts you because if you're one of them and you're on their team and you're against the other team, it gives you a sort of purpose, like a reason, raison d'etre, a reason to be, and like a meaning behind your life, and you've got all these like friends and companions and I shouldn't say comrade in this context, if you know what I'm saying, but you know what I'm trying to say. Could be at some level, and then once you've acclimatized yourself in that, then you're like, well, but if maybe this developmental hierarchy was wrong. Maybe this is obviously just the right way to do things, and then to think that you're going to like develop like out of this into a morally neutral, scientific, rational thing where you forget about the importance of good and evil, and then like what, you're going to be a transhumanist. You're going to violate whatever is sacred about the human condition to be some sort of cyborg machine, transgender, like immortal, internet AI ghost person. Like that is horrifying. That is ungodly. That is evil. And so I prefer to stay with this group of fundamentalist Amish extremists, Mormons who believe we're going to get teleported out to the rapture, because it gives me, that's something to believe in. And rather than just me being judged as being delusional, I'm now surrounded by a bunch of people who we're on the same level now, right? There's like, I think this is kind of what has happened basically developmentally is that by trying to integrate the shadow, the alchemists among us have basically shadow crashed back to this blue level. And there's also this whole issue about like the hierarchy of the tech bros, right? Basically, when I used to work more of a 9-to-5 shift job, I got a job really easily working at a computer store because I was of the generation that had, it's just, if you're of a certain age, you know how to use a computer, right? The fact that you have a skill where you know how to use a computer puts you at an advantage over a whole swath of the population who has no fucking clue what they're doing with a computer, right? It's also interesting to me to watch the way that the boomer generation is, in that there are boomers who may have, there's also this weird disparity because there are so many people, especially if you consider like Silicon Valley, the whole tech industry, there's so many people that if that was your career, it was to be in tech, that there could be so many boomers or older people that are highly, highly, highly sophisticated and advanced with technology. But if you didn't specialize in it, chances are what little grasp you had on technology is only getting worse. And so that you don't have, like, there's all these people who imagine themselves to be at this level of, like, we are the scientific, rational class of the technical elite who have built ourselves a fortune and privilege in society. But then when you ask them how to install an app on their phone, they'd have no idea. They don't know the most basic. They basically have constructed this whole technocratic or whatever technological apparatus that treats them as if they are a simple child who doesn't know how to do anything, because in that context, that's basically what they are, right? But at the same time, they believe they are like I'm university educated, I know everything, and I'm the authority. But they don't have. So this creates this differential where if you know anything about technology at all, you have this there are masses of idiots. But the problem about this is that the more that you're like, okay, I've got a certain like angle to work, and that I have a certain skill set that puts me at a competitive advantage, and that in the face of this, our old racial coding of like the racial hierarchies that our society have been constructed on, and it's not joke. There's no joke about this here. Even where I live in Canada, there were Point Grey in Vancouver was coded as if you were not white. If you had brown skin, if you came from India or China, they wouldn't let you buy property in this one neighborhood because this was only for rich white people, right? And then, so now we have the psychogeography of our landscape is defined by these old cultural zoning habits, where if you were the white master race, you got to hang out in your little part of town, and if you were just like a underclass immigrant, you got to like. It turns out that so many people of this supposed superior race there might be some person in India who can do it better than them, and that has more technical, like that these supposedly the third world people have more technical ability than, you're not guaranteed anything just because of your in-group belonging based on your ethno-tribal, coding or whatever, right? And in this sort of uncertainty that there's certain like, what defines skilled labor versus not skilled labor, and that it's not even the problem about this in my personal experience. It's not even an issue of the fear of the other, the outsider, as like the immigrant immigrants who are coming to steal your job, to take all the housing away, but rather in a digital internet world, then any job you do on a computer can be easily outsourced to somebody else, whoever's willing to do the job the cheapest. It's a global market, so you've got the whole fucking world to compete with, right? So even if you develop a skill in that market, then you're basically it's the whole world is competing with you for this one. And good luck if you can find any work doing that, right? And then you've got this differential where the people who are working if you're in a place like Southeast Asia, you have what do you pay for what's your phone bill in what's your internet bill in Southeast Asia versus what's your internet bill if you're in one of these highly developed Western countries, right? And what are you getting paid for your hourly wage, or what you're getting paid to do the job versus what are you paying your overhead, the cost of your internet connection, the cost of your equipment, the cost of living versus, so you're having somebody else who has a very different cost of living standard is going to be able to at a competitive wage difference, and your work, the more digital or online it is, the more it's just going to go to even out whoever can do it the cheapest or the fastest, all this kind of stuff, right? And it's in this situation where like if things level out, right? Whatever competitive, it's kind of, or does it? You have some sort of competitive advantage, and it levels out, and we're all equal, basically, right? But in some way, it still isn't, though, because there's something about this where it's like, if there's this, I find bring it back to the astrology, Sun, Neptune, there's some kind of thing about like being, all men are created equal under God, right? And the principle of equality, and that, there's nothing about me that's inherently better than a person with a different ethnic background. And that, maybe if in my own life, maybe if my job that I work on a computer doing digital labor, if the more that gets outsourced, to some other person in another country who's able to do the same work for cheaper. What's so bad? What do I really want to be stuck in front of a computer all day anyways, right? Maybe instead of doing that, maybe I'd want to work in the farm, right? Maybe I want to be an organic farmer. Maybe I want to get back to the earth, right? And rather than playing around with pixels and megabytes and gigabytes or whatever, I want to be working with the land, right? Now the thing is that where I live, we have, the whole thing isn't just like, it's not just migrant workers, but rather the area that I live is predicted to explode in population, probably double in population at least over the next couple decades. And there's already a large, I don't know, it's just the fact of the matter that most, even if you live in the image of like white rural farming community, it's mostly a bunch of Indian people, and there's a certain class. I don't know, it's like a certain class, right? Where there's something basic, like there's a kind of a people that go. They don't. It's not. It's kind of funny because from the perspective of being a subject of this society, there's some people that go to work, they have a car, maybe they work in the city, you have to spend an hour commuting every day, you drive to the city, you clock in, you work your job, you drive back home, you're stuck in rush hour, that kind of thing. There's another group of people who, rather than driving cars, they all get on board a school bus or some sort of bus that's been repurposed, and then they all get taken out to the farm, and then they're all under the hot sun, they're picking blueberries all day, right? And then there's also, adjacent to the blueberry fields, they've built houses which are like giant mansions, that where the whole family is, rather than having this idea that your family is like each of them are individualized, atomized people, where it's like the wife and kids and you're each in your own little house in the suburbs. You have these massive palaces where you have multiple generations of family members living together, right? There's also interesting because in my area there was a project where they were going to build housing right next to the farm for all these supposedly the kind of workers that would get on board the bus and then go to the farm. They're going to build these housing complexes to house workers in a high density right on the farm, so they don't even have to commute. But this was against the zoning bylaw, right? And so it's like there's this kind of thing where there's like, even if so, at the level of me doing online digital work, it's basically it's an even playing field. But there's people who are, maybe if you're living in a country where you get the same internet connection for a much cheaper rate, or you don't have the same overhead to pay off with your cost of living, you have a competitive advantage to do the job cheaper, right? And then if you are, if you grow disenchanted trying to do that as a white guy, in a brick and mortar, you're actually going to work in a brick and mortar building to sit in front of a computer all day, where you can easily just pay people cheaper to not have to handle that kind of overhead, right? It starts to be like, maybe it's depressing that all my work is getting taken away from me, and that I don't even see the sun. I just stay inside an office building all day, and then I'm surrounded by ghettos and crime and poverty and all this kind of stuff. Maybe it's more wholesome to go back to the country and work on the farm, but then it's like there's this sense that you're like, my whole life my subjectivity has been constructed in such a way that I'm supposed to think of myself as the guy who drives his. Well, it's kind of confusing because there's something about this idea of being stuck in rush hour traffic every day, to go be stuck in a cubicle in an office building to do work that's slowly getting taken from you by other people in other countries. It's like, it seems more romantic from that position to become like an organic farmer or something like that. But then you start to run in, like, there's this. there's a necessity because you feel, as a white person, you feel guilty that there's all these other people that apparently work much harder to support our society in terms of producing food or all the vital things that you need. And like, if you could see people that work in the tech industry too, right? Like imagine that you put all your hours into producing a video game that is basically may or may not even be successful, may be even well liked. There's plenty of video games where people put years and years and years into it and it's a flop. And then imagine if you spent years and years and years working on something that sucks, that nobody likes, or even if you do, it's just like an escapist fantasy for people, versus you could go in the field and you could produce the vital things that we need to survive and live day by day and make a real, honest to God contribution. But then in order to do that, you're basically like, we've given all that job to do for the immigrants who are racially like, there's not even that. In all this tension, when I was psychotic, part of the recovery program was there's this place called Earthwise Gardens where apparently, I think I'm starting to read between the lines or interpret this is probably a common pattern, that people have psychosis that are completely fed up with what it means to survive and live within this kind of a society, and that they say maybe it's much better for me, rather than to be hunched over a computer keyboard and being trying to do all this abstract digital work, that to do the honest good farming work. But then quickly you start to feel, or like they're basically going to be like, okay, we're going to give you weird, like, you psychotic manic stoner kids, we're going to try to give you a little bit of what you think you want and see how you do with that, instead of giving you a whole, day's shift trying to do fruit picking in the fields. We're going with people who are part of a different kind of cultural in-group. We're going to take all you people that are who have been apprehended under the Mental Health Act and are psychotic, and we're going to give you 1 hour of working on the field while heavily medicated under sedative antipsychotic drugs, and just see how you do with that, right? And like, to give people, and we're going to pay you $10 for that, right? And then to be like, now, would you want to, it's not impossible to do this, but do you really think you want to do this all day long in the field, not with a bunch of people that are a bunch of like psychotic young people, but with a bunch of like old ladies from India who may not even speak the same language? What do you think you're going to get on the same bus with these people and do the same work? No, probably not. Like, I don't want to be like, I don't have any racist bias or judgment towards, I don't know. I mean, I don't look at it that way, but the structure of where we live is structured. The old, how our society was built that there are rich white people who live in neighborhoods that they wouldn't let these people live in, and then they would be like, that our railroad was built by the Chinese, basically, right? That there are people who are conditioned to be, society conditions you to be a field worker, or it conditions you to be like I think of yourself as like, I'm going to be like a lawyer that drives to work in my Lexus, and I get paid enormous amounts of money for just filling up a filing cabinets full of paperwork, and that is valued to be more important than the person who gives us food to live off every day, right? Isn't this seem like there's something kind of off about this, that it's like the most important jobs are the lowest and least rewarded, and that there are people who basically create an empire off of a pile of paperwork bullshit, a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo. But if you're able to do that, if you go to law school, you pass the bar, you're part of this power hierarchy. If you are a fucking acid head stoner burnout and you think you have to go work in the field, that just proves how much of a fucking loser you are. And that affirms this, like, this is like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, oh, you just failed at being a successful white person. Now you think you have to be, you have to surrender yourself to be like, oh, I'm no better than the Indian person or the Mexican or whatever. Like, but then it's like, it's this weird thing where like, this is like, we're in a, I don't know, what's the virtue of being a hard worker, right? And then we have all this, like, there's all this pressure, this background pressure all the time to like work hard and to be productive, like the Protestant work ethic or whatever. And that it's like all of this dynamic creates a situation where it's like, well, rather than worrying about this, what if all this is happening in the context where there really are aliens? Or what if the rapture is going to happen tomorrow and I just don't have to worry about this, right? Oh God, wouldn't that be great? Like this whole problem, like, well, I just wasted a fucking hour talking about this shit because the fucking God's just going to fucking beam me up, Scotty, because I'm a true believer, right? Like you start to see the appeal, right? I don't want to be condescending of people who are like this because it's sort of like, it gives you just something else to focus your attention on rather than these problems which don't seem to have an immediate solution, right? Or just seem to reinforce the in-group dynamics which are built under the surface of the system, which apparently, as whatever we see going on in America, they still haven't gotten over this stuff, right? And it's still very much this thing about like, you on our team, you good, you on their team, you bad. And then these other people are going to come and take our stuff from us. And, or that if you think you are going to become being equal is basically being an idiot or something like that. You are like it's like you are a naive child, right? You are a naive, underdeveloped, regressive child for thinking this way. A mature person wouldn't think like that, right? So I don't know. Maybe I'm not focusing so much on the thing about the Christian rapture, but I'm trying to say, for me, it had a lot to do with my Neptune transit, or there's some kind of like those moments where life just seems like it sucks, and that you just wish that you were just going to get beamed up to some other dimension that you wouldn't have to deal with what's going on in your. Or there's also this kind of like, I don't know. I don't want to be. It's like you don't want to kill yourself. You don't want to just make it self-destructive. You want to hope for some solution, but because the real world isn't really offering that solution, you have to create a fantasy of aliens, the supernatural, or something. I mean, even if it's, the thing is like, I think that there's something, the archetype of redemption, right? That in the midst of all this mess, if there's something more to the story than just this bullshit, then it sort of redeems, like if it's like, yeah, but like in all the midst of this, what if there's actually like an intergalactic federation, and that there are like spiritual beings from other dimensions that are trying to harmonize us for love and light. It's something to hope, give you hope for what's going on, rather than just to be nihilistic and pessimistic and cynical, right? And this is basically what I'm trying to aim at, is that I think that there's some kind of I can't say that I'm entirely beyond this, and that I kind of like watching weird UFO videos or paranormal stuff, or like that, and that I'm not completely or maybe sometimes I get more attracted to that things which provide more of an escape when I don't feel like I don't want to be here, right? And I don't know. The funny thing about, I don't even know how to, astrology itself as a practice is kind of interesting to me, because it's like, there's some kind of attitude where like, instead of like looking up at the sky and thinking about like, wow, I wonder if there's any flying saucers up there. Instead, you're just looking at the actual stars and planets, and then like being like, even if there aren't flying saucers, even if the whole UFO thing is phony, a hoax, a psyop, even if it's all fake, then the fact that historically, even like, there's something about astrology and tarot and stuff like that, which I use because I just think it seems like it works for me. And okay, to bring it back, I'll tie it in together. The point is that even if people are doing, I don't believe in the Christian rapture. I'm not a religious fundamentalist. But the fact that they've timed this up with the sun opposite Neptune, are these people using astrology to time their rapture? Or is it that the archetypes, especially because people have talked about this grand air trine that's getting set off here, the idea of Uranus and Gemini being the communicator, the messenger, or like Mercury sign. Gemini is all about communication, messaging, chit-chatting, all this kind of stuff. Uranus is in there disrupting it in this trine to Pluto. Pluto stands for hidden power dynamics, coercion, psyops, stuff like that. And there's this idea that what if TikTok, this is why I don't use TikTok. What if TikTok is constructed in such a way that the TikTok algorithms promote, like if you are using TikTok as a psyop against another government, you could engineer your algorithm to be like, how if somebody talks about some crazy Christian fundamentalist rapture bullshit, then we're going to prioritize that on the algorithm. The craziest bullshit gets the most plays, gets the most, and the things that are more rational, we're gonna promote that for our version, so that because if we value rational, if we basically see as our competitive edge that we are going to be more rational, more scientific, better educated, and that we see your escapist, fundamentalist, regressive tendencies as being weaknesses, then we can design our social media algorithm to promote the things that aggravate your weaknesses and counteractively promote our strengths to leverage the competitive differential that our culture or our nation will have over the other culture and the other nation. And that I basically have chosen to avoid using TikTok because I believe that it's explicitly engineered in a destructive way to aggravate these problems on purpose, right? And that if I choose to use YouTube and produce content on here, my attitude has been, it's just basically what I was trying to say, to tie it back in what I was talking about before, a byproduct of my, rather than wasting energy on TikTok, Instagram, social media, I choose instead to read a bunch of philosophy and critical theory and stuff like that. But I'm realizing that it's kind of an odd match, because it's like, if I was using, like, what's happened since then is that the guy that I took a course from back in, was it 2018, 2019, I took a course, he was doing this thing where he was getting off of Facebook, he was getting off of Instagram, but now he talks about being on Instagram all the time. Or there's this kind of like, if you're going to be an online astrologer or an online divinator, is it like absolutely necessary that you have to use Instagram to promote your business, or that you're like, this whole thing, it's like an unviable business unless you just like give into Mark Zuckerberg, you give into these tech platforms that have also made themselves in bed with Donald Trump. Right? They made themselves it's like, there's only one way to have a business, and it's basically to comply with your tech baron overlords, regardless of whether, and then even if they're using the same platforms to make everybody into like a bunch of like fundamentalist, they think the rapture is happening. And you're going to be like, but if I'm going to make my business work, I have to like be on those platforms and try to basically see them as a bunch of gullible idiots that I have to be taking advantage of, like I'm a con man or something. You know what I'm trying to say? It's like, yeah, that doesn't seem like the greatest, doesn't seem so great. I think maybe like to avoid that and to read to try to take what's good. Like there's a certain, trying to appeal to that crowd, not so great. But if you're going to like introduce me to some literature that challenges my thinking, that maybe allows me to grow my mind, to expand my horizons, to have a more mature and nuanced or sophisticated perspective, if there's an opportunity to take it that direction, this is more promising to me. And it's like, in some way that it's like, there's a part, the soul that is challenged by these circumstances wants a transcendent release from the environment, but being able to have access to quality literature and to be able to help to develop your mind to be more sophisticated and educated and have a different view on reality is somehow it sort of fills a little bit of the same desire. I mean, maybe you don't escape your material circumstances immediately, but it's this idea that I mean, I don't know, there's still this materialist, idealist dialectic, but there's this idea that what or if you take it back to the New Agers, does your consciousness influence your reality, right? Do the things that you believe in, your values, your principles, does that in turn shape the way that you relate to the world around you, how you interact with or care for the people around you? And that is there a way that we can encourage, give better fertilizer and nutrients, that if we're all plants, that we're growing into healthier, happier, better plants that are intent create a better ecosystem for the world around us? Or are we poisoning the well with things that exploit the weaknesses that accelerate social collapse and social demise, basically, right? And I basically, for this reason, choose to avoid the TikTok, Instagram, and I still use Facebook. I think my policy is to use Facebook in a utilitarian sense rather than just to if I need to use Facebook Marketplace or something, it could be useful, right? But there's something about these platforms which I'm choosing not to use them. And I'm seeing the certain trends like the Tik-Tok Rapture as just a like a sign, basically. Like the Tik-Tok Rapture. There's something about this. Alienation. I don't know.